December 19th, 1944. A grey dawn pressed over the Ardennes. The forest was quiet, but not peaceful. Snow swirled in icy gusts, mixing the sharp smell of pine with diesel and cold metal. Inside a camouflaged M10 Wolverine, one gunner peered through the periscope. His hands shook, not from fear, but from the biting cold. Ahead, a dozen German tanks rumbled forward, unaware that the man watching them had no orders to fire. Discipline told him to wait. Every instinct screamed to strike. One wrong move could mean death or victory. Yet, in that frozen forest, a single soldier's choice would stop a panzer column and change the fate of hundreds. How did one man, a quiet gunner, take on an entire armored force and survive? Hit subscribe, support the channel, like this video, and watch the full story to see how precision, courage, and one daring decision reshaped a battlefield. December 19th, 1944. The Ardennes forest was quiet, but not peaceful. Snow hung in the trees like a heavy curtain, and the wind cut through the branches, carrying the smell of wet pine and frozen earth. From under a camouflage net, Private First Class Ray Thompson sat inside his M10 Wolverine tank destroyer. His hands, covered with thick gloves, shook, not from fear, but from the cold that bit through every layer of clothing. His breath fogged the periscope as he scanned the narrow forest road ahead. About 800 yards away, German tanks moved slowly through the trees. There were 12 of them, mostly Panzer IVs, and a Tiger IX at the front. Behind the tanks came half-tracks carrying soldiers, fuel trucks, and support vehicles. The column snaked forward like a steel snake through the white forest. Thompson knew that if these vehicles reached the Noville crossroads, they could cut off supplies to the 101st Airborne Division, trapped in Bastogne. He had no orders to fire. He had to wait, report, and do exactly as told, but every muscle in him tensed. The rules were clear. Just 3 days before, Thompson had sat in a cold farmhouse near the front, listening to his commanding officer, Captain Langston, explain the rules. "No one fires without confirmation from command," Langston had said. "Even if the enemy is right there, you wait." The men nodded silently. Outside, the forest was quiet, but tension hovered in the room like smoke. Every soldier understood the danger. Mistakes could mean death for themselves and others. Ray had already seen war at its worst. In Normandy, a panzer shell had caught his friend Jimmy Delgado's half-track, killing him instantly. Another comrade, Frank Murray, had stepped on a mine and was gone in a flash. Thompson learned quickly that luck was scarce in combat, but patterns, those could be studied, understood, and predicted. He began to carry a small spiral notebook, sketching tanks, noting angles, and marking weaknesses. He knew the German column like a mathematician knows numbers. The Tiger led, heavy and unstoppable. The Panzer IVs followed in disciplined formation. Fuel trucks and ammunition carriers stayed in the middle, shielded by steel in front. Thompson traced their movements in his mind where they paused, how the turrets rotated, how long it took for a tank to turn. He didn't just see tanks, he saw a system, a machine that could be broken if struck correctly. Still, he waited. The rules demanded it. Waiting was supposed to keep him safe, yet each second felt dangerous. The closer the German vehicles crept, the more Thompson understood the stakes. The 101st Airborne Division's last supply line could vanish if the column advanced unopposed. Every frozen breath reminded him that time was running out. The forest, silent but heavy with snow, became a pressure cooker. Through his fogged periscope, he noticed tiny details, tracks pressed into the snow, treads cutting pine branches, shadows shifting on the icy road. Each note he wrote, range, bearing, wind speed, was a calculation. He imagined the perfect sequence: which tank to hit first, how a single shot could block the column, how chaos could spread like fire. But still, he could not act. Discipline was drilled into him. One wrong move could kill his crew or reveal their position to the Germans. Yet there was irony in it. Thompson, trained to obey, understood more than anyone that sometimes the safest choice was the one the rules forbade. He studied the enemy, counted their formations, and calculated trajectories, all without touching the trigger. It was paradoxical. His most powerful weapon was patience, but patience could also mean disaster. The wind shifted. Snowflakes swirled past the periscope. Diesel smoke from the German engines carried faintly on the air. Thompson's eyes traced the Tiger at the head of the column, then the Panzer IVs, then the half-tracks. He felt the cold in his bones, the weight of silence pressing on him. And yet, beneath that, a thought stirred: the rules might be wrong. Waiting could cost lives. This was the moment when observation became planning, and planning became action. The Ardennes forest waited, unaware of the decision about to be made. One soldier, inside a metal tank, measured the world in inches, degrees, and seconds. Outside, a steel column advanced, confident and disciplined, toward a crossroads that could change everything. But this was only the beginning. What Thompson saw next would test not just his skill, but the very limits of obedience and courage in war. 3 days before the German column appeared in the Ardennes, Ray Thompson had been inside a cold, drafty farmhouse near the front lines. He and his crew were huddled around a small metal table, while Captain Langston explained the rules. "No one fires without confirmation from command," the captain said flatly. "Even if the enemy is right in front of you, even if you can see them clearly, you wait for orders." The men nodded, but the tension in the room was thick. Everyone knew the Germans were moving fast, and every hour of delay could cost lives. Rules in war are supposed to protect soldiers, but sometimes they can feel like a trap. Thompson understood this better than most. On paper, waiting was safe. In reality, waiting could mean watching an entire enemy column march into your lines. He remembered Normandy, where a friend was vaporized by a mine because someone hesitated. The lesson was clear: rules saved lives, but hesitation could take them. The 702nd Tank Destroyer Battalion, Thompson's unit, was designed for discipline. Each gunner, loader, and driver had a precise role. Their M10 Wolverines were effective, fast, and deadly, but only if used correctly. Firing without orders could lead to friendly fire, reveal positions, or bring artillery down on their own heads. Still, Ray had studied the rules not just to follow them, but to understand where they might fail. The Battle of the Bulge had already begun on December 16th. The Germans launched Operation Watch on the Rhine, sending more than 200,000 men and over 1,000 tanks into the Ardennes with the goal of splitting the Allied line and capturing Antwerp. Surprise was on their side. American positions shifted constantly. Some units disappeared overnight. In such chaos, commanders feared mistakes as much as the enemy. Radios often failed. Conflicting orders came from every direction. Soldiers were caught between strict protocols and the raw reality of combat. Thompson's job was observation. From a ridge near Neuville, he could see the valley below and the roads leading to Bastogne. His crew trusted him because he was precise and calm. Every morning he measured distances, sketched enemy movements, counted vehicles, and logged details in a notebook his mother had sent him months earlier. Each entry noted range, bearing, wind, and terrain. "It was like watching a machine move," he later wrote. "I didn't see men, I saw patterns." Observation was supposed to be safe, but it could also feel deadly. The cold bit through their jackets. Metal creaked as the M10 shivered in the frost. The smell of oil, grease, and snow filled the air. Every shift of a branch, every puff of smoke from an engine, told a story. And yet, Thompson's eyes kept returning to the main road, imagining the potential consequences if the Germans reached the crossroads. Paradoxically, obeying the rules required patience, but patience itself carried risk. Waiting could mean survival or catastrophe. Thompson knew that the smallest miscalculation could cost the lives of his crew, the paratroopers in Bastogne, or countless others. And still, he waited, recording, calculating, imagining the perfect strike. His 3-man crew watched him quietly. They knew he was meticulous, but none of them had yet seen the way his mind worked. He did not panic. He did not shout. He simply measured, sketched, and planned. Discipline was his strength, but so was understanding when the rules were insufficient. Outside, the snow continued to fall. The forest remained silent except for the distant hum of engines. The Germans moved, unaware of the observer who studied them like a chess player, studies aboard. Thompson's calculations were about more than firing. They were about timing, distance, and sequence. Each note he made was a step toward the moment when he might have to decide, without orders, how to act. By the evening of December 18th, Thompson's notebook was full. Every vehicle in the column, every possible approach, every weak point was mapped in his mind. He had followed the rules, observed patiently, and understood the stakes. And yet, a quiet voice inside him warned, rules could fail when decisions were delayed. Obedience might be deadly. What Thompson faced was not just the enemy. It was the paradox of discipline in war. To obey could mean death. To act without orders could save hundreds, and soon the choice would come. The Battle of the Bulge was in full swing. On December 16, 1944, the Germans had launched their last major attack on the Western Front. They called it Operation Watch on the Rhine. Over 200,000 German soldiers and more than 1,000 tanks pushed through the Ardennes forest. Their goal was simple: split the Allied forces in two, capture Antwerp, and force the Allies to negotiate. What they achieved was chaos. American lines were stretched thin, and many units disappeared overnight. Soldiers who had been in one position woke to find their neighbors gone, replaced by strangers or empty foxholes. Confusion was everywhere. Radios crackled with mixed messages. Orders came late, and some commanders didn't know which way their troops were facing. Thompson's battalion, the 702nd Tank Destroyer, was in the thick of it, dug into a ridge near Noville. For the Americans, the enemy didn't just come from the front. Friendly fire, miscommunication, and mistakes could be as deadly as the German tanks themselves. The rules were strict: wait for orders. But in the chaos of the Bulge, orders were slow or missing entirely. Soldiers had to watch, calculate, and sometimes decide what to do on their own. It was a harsh paradox. Obedience was meant to protect them, but rigid obedience could get them killed. Thompson understood the scale of the attack. At the front, the Tiger Seconds were powerful and heavily armored. Behind them, Panzer Fords moved in precise formation. Support vehicles carried fuel, ammunition, and food, while half-tracks held infantry ready to fight. Every column was a well-oiled machine. If they reached the Noville crossroads, the 101st Airborne Division in Bastogne would lose its last major supply line. Tens of thousands of American soldiers would be trapped in freezing conditions. From his periscope, Thompson watched the forest road as the tanks crept forward. Snow crunched under their treads, branches snapped, and exhaust smoke mixed with the cold air. His eyes traced the movement carefully. He could see where the vehicles slowed, where they turned, and where they were most vulnerable. Each movement was a note in his mental map, each pattern a potential opening. The Americans in the Ardennes were outnumbered and surprised, but some soldiers noticed a different kind of enemy: the unpredictability of war itself. Thompson wrote in his notebook later, "The snow hid everything, but also made everything clearer. The patterns showed themselves if you watched long enough." He studied the tanks like a puzzle, knowing that understanding them was the key to survival. Statistics from the battle highlight the danger. The Germans had 1,200 tanks in the Ardennes sector, over 600 artillery pieces, and 200,000 men pressing forward. The Americans had far fewer resources in the area, and the 101st Airborne Division was surrounded in Bastogne with only 20,000 men. The difference was clear. One misstep could be fatal. And yet, even in the face of these overwhelming numbers, Thompson noticed something. The German soldiers moved with confidence. They believed the Americans were disorganized, slow, and reactive. That belief was their weakness. Thompson began to plan in his head. Where could a single gunner make the biggest impact? How could he use the enemy's strength against them? The forest itself added another layer. The road was narrow, barely wider than the column. Thick trees hemmed in both sides, leaving little room to maneuver. Snow covered the ground and muffled sounds. Fog hung low, twisting light and shadow. From the ridge, Thompson had a perfect view. He could see every engine, every turret, every soldier moving along the steel line. Witnesses later said the silence of that morning was strange. "It was like the forest was holding its breath," wrote one infantryman. Diesel smoke, the faint smell of fuel, and the crunch of snow created a tense, almost unreal atmosphere. It was quiet, yet the weight of what was about to happen pressed down on everyone. Thompson's mind worked like a machine. He didn't just see tanks, he saw patterns. He calculated angles, distances, and timing. He imagined the effect of a single shell hitting a specific vehicle. Each choice could change the course of the battle. In the midst of a massive offensive, a small decision might become a turning point. The paradox was clear. In a war defined by numbers, orders, and overwhelming force, a single man could make a difference. One careful calculation, one precise shot, could save lives where armies might fail. And that moment was fast approaching. Ray Thompson was not born to be a soldier. He grew up in western Kansas, where the flat land stretched for miles and winters were sharp enough to crack the wood on barns. His father, Charles, ran a small engine repair shop. His mother, Anna, taught 7th grade math. From a young age, Ray was surrounded by gears, tools, and numbers. He learned to see the world in angles and measurements. As a boy, he built slingshots with pulleys and counterweights, measuring exactly how far he could launch a pebble. Everything he did had precision. When he joined the army in 1942, it wasn't because he wanted to fight. He joined for training, steady pay, and a chance to learn. By the time he arrived in Normandy, he was 22 but looked older, hardened by the realities of war. Thompson's first combat experiences were brutal. In the hedgerows of Normandy, he saw friends die in sudden, shocking ways. Jimmy Delgado was burned alive when a Panzer shell hit his half-track. Frank Murray was killed by a mine. After these losses, Thompson stopped believing in luck or orders. He believed in patterns. He observed, sketched, and memorized everything about enemy movements. He began carrying a small spiral notebook, recording every tank, half-track, and support vehicle he saw. He noted weak spots, blind spots, and angles of attack. He became methodical, calm, and quiet. Fellow soldiers nicknamed him the Quiet Clock because his words were measured and precise. But his mind was active, calculating, always thinking several steps ahead. By the time he reached the Ardennes, Thompson had mastered one critical skill, seeing a battlefield like a chessboard. He understood formations, timing, and how to exploit enemy routines. Observation was not passive. It was preparation. He didn't just watch the Germans move. He planned how to stop them, if the moment ever came. Despite his skill, he still followed orders. He knew the cost of firing too soon. One wrong shot could mean death for his crew, or reveal their position to German tanks. But he also understood the paradox of war. Strict obedience could be deadly if the enemy's advance left no time for orders. Thompson had to prepare for a moment when he might have to act alone. On the morning of December 19th, the moment arrived. The forest was heavy with fog. Snowflakes drifted slowly, covering the tracks of the approaching column. The Tiger I tank led the formation, followed by Panzer IV's half-tracks, fuel trucks, and support vehicles. Thompson's crew waited silently, trusting his judgment. Diesel fumes mixed with the scent of snow and pine. The crunch of treads on icy ground was the only sound. Thompson studied the column. Each vehicle was a piece of a puzzle. He noticed patterns in their movement. The Tiger was fast but predictable. The Panzer IVs moved tightly behind it, and support vehicles relied on the armored front for protection. A mistake or early shot could trigger disaster. But if he targeted the right vehicles in the right sequence, he could create a chain reaction, halting the column and saving the road. The paradox deepened. Obedience demanded waiting, yet waiting could cost hundreds of lives. Discipline required him to stay quiet, but action required him to break protocol. Thompson didn't hesitate. He understood the stakes. His training, his observations, and his careful study of enemy tactics converged. He could no longer be just an observer. From his vantage point, the forest was both ally and enemy. Thick trees limited the Germans' movement, but also restricted his own. Snow muffled sound, but carried the smell of diesel and smoke. Every detail mattered. He measured distance, elevation, and timing. He calculated the angle to hit the third vehicle first, then the sixth, then the eighth. Each shot would create maximum chaos. Each shot would rely on precision, not power. Thompson's decision was not reckless. It was calculated. For years he had studied how enemy vehicles moved in tight formations. He knew exactly where to strike to block the column and create panic. His preparation had brought him to this point, alone in a frozen forest facing a German armored column, ready to act without orders. The paradox was clear. A single man, obeying the rules, might have done nothing. Acting without orders, he could save hundreds. The forest held its breath. The German column moved forward, unaware of the decision being made in a small metal tank, hidden under a camouflage net. One soldier, one notebook, one calculated sequence. The moment of action had arrived. December 19th, 1944, dawned grey and cold. The fog hung low in the Ardennes forest, twisting light and shadow. The German column moved forward along a narrow road, engines humming through the silence. A tiger eye led the line, followed closely by Panzer fourths, half-tracks, and supply vehicles. Every movement was orderly, disciplined, and confident. To the Germans, it seemed the Americans were scattered and slow. But from Thompson's hidden M10 Wolverine, the scene was very different. Thompson's hands were cold inside his gloves, and frost clung to the metal of the tank. His breath came in white puffs, each exhale a reminder of the harsh winter. Around him, the three-man crew remained silent, trusting his judgment completely. They had seen him study columns before, but now the real test had come. The paradox of obedience and initiative pressed down. Waiting for orders could be deadly, but acting without them could bring disaster if miscalculated. Through his frosted periscope, Thompson watched the Tiger lead the way. He didn't aim at the first vehicle. Instead, he aimed at the 3rd Panzer IV, understanding how a precise strike could halt the flow of the column. He remembered what he had written in his notebook. Controlled collapse, pull one piece, the rest fall in sequence. This was no random firing. It was a calculated chain reaction. The first shell left the barrel with a deafening roar, echoing through the trees. Snow sprayed into the air as the shell hit the flank of the Panzer IV, flames and smoke erupted, and the German formation froze. Behind the burning tank, half-tracks carrying infantry collided with immobilized vehicles. Panic spread quickly. Soldiers shouted, pointing at the trees, unsure where the attack came from. Thompson repositioned slightly, just enough to confuse any German gunners who might spot the muzzle flash. He fired again at the 6th vehicle, a fuel truck in the middle of the column. The explosion was instant, sending fire and debris into the air. The forest seemed alive with chaos. Soldiers ran in every direction, some into trees, others slipping in the snow, trying to escape the inferno. His crew, now fully alert, moved efficiently. Each shell was loaded and fired with precision. Thompson didn't rush. He calculated. The 8th shot struck another fuel truck at the rear. The chain reaction spread, blocking the road and trapping armored vehicles. German tanks tried to maneuver, but found the road clogged and narrow. Their discipline, so effective in open terrain, became a trap. Witnesses later described the scene in disbelief. One soldier wrote, "It was like the trees had eyes and the forest was shooting back." Another said he saw muzzle flashes from 3 different angles, though there was only one gunner. The Germans imagined an entire battery ambushed them, but in reality, it was one man with a plan, one M10 tank, and 3 calm crew members. Statistics show the power of Thompson's action. 7 German vehicles were destroyed, 4 more were disabled, and 0 American lives were lost. One critical road remained open, saving the supply line for the 101st Airborne Division in Bastogne. The numbers show a clear fact. One man's precise decisions had a strategic impact far beyond what anyone expected. The smell of diesel, cordite, and burning fuel filled the forest. Trees splintered under shock waves. Snow turned grey with ash. Thompson's mind stayed focused, reading each movement and adjusting his aim. Every new position was chosen for cover, elevation, and maximum confusion. The Germans didn't just face fire, they faced unpredictability. They thought there were multiple tanks and batteries, but it was only Thompson. This day showed a harsh truth. In war, thinking can be as powerful as firepower. Discipline is important, but understanding when to act alone can save lives. Thompson's methodical targeting, using sequence and timing rather than sheer force, turned a narrow forest road into a battlefield advantage. By the time the last shots were fired, the German column was in chaos. Flames and smoke filled the valley. Soldiers scrambled, abandoned vehicles, and tried to retreat. The tiger at the front was finally immobilized, trapped by the wreckage behind it. Thompson's quiet calculations had dismantled the column without direct confrontation, showing that strategy and precision could outweigh numbers. And yet, Thompson remained calm. He didn't celebrate. The forest returned to its eerie silence, broken only by distant screams and the crackling of fire. He and his crew understood what had happened, but the real weight of their action, the lives saved and the danger avoided, would take time to sink in. After the firing stopped, the Ardennes forest was quiet again, but it looked like a disaster zone. Black smoke rose from burning vehicles. Trees lay splintered on the snow. German tanks and trucks were twisted, burned, and stuck. Tracks dug deep into the ground showed where vehicles had skidded or crashed. Yet, there were no American casualties. Only one M10 Wolverine and its three-man crew had faced a German armored column and survived. Thompson's crew was exhausted, hands blistered from loading shells, bodies stiff from cold and tension. The smell of smoke, diesel, and hot metal hung thick inside the tank. The loader offered Thompson a sip of water, but he only nodded, staring at the road and the destroyed enemy vehicles. It was over, yet the weight of disobedience pressed on him. They had fired without orders, and Thompson expected to be court-martialed. Meanwhile, German soldiers were in total confusion. Some ran into the forest for cover. Others climbed onto tanks, trying to see what had attacked them. They fired wildly, but their efforts were useless. One officer later said, "It felt like the trees were shooting at us. I couldn't believe one tank could do this." Another soldier claimed to see flashes from multiple directions. Fear made them invent enemies that didn't exist. In reality, it was only Thompson and his carefully calculated shots. The Americans later reviewed the aftermath. 7 German vehicles were destroyed, 4 were damaged, and the road to Noville was still open. The 101st Airborne Division could receive supplies again. A single soldier, acting without orders, had saved hundreds of lives and prevented a disaster. Thompson's notebook, filled with sketches, distances, and patterns, became proof of his careful planning and calculation. Back at battalion headquarters, Thompson filed his report. Captain Langston read it silently, flipping through the pages. Thompson's notes were precise: which vehicles were targeted, in what order, and why. Langston finally said, "If this had gone wrong, you could have killed Americans or yourself." Thompson replied simply, "I knew what I saw." Langston paused, then nodded. They had no proof of disobedience because the radio lines had been jammed. Orders hadn't reached Thompson. Days later, scouts from the 101st Airborne arrived at Noville. They expected to see a German column still moving, but instead they found burning wreckage. They asked which unit had done this. Langston said it wasn't a unit, it was one gunner. Word spread across battalion mess tents and radio lines. Soldiers began telling the story of the Kansas man who had taken out a Panzer column alone. Some exaggerated the story, saying it was 10 tanks or 5 shells or trick shots. But the truth was even more impressive: careful calculation, precision, and courage. American intelligence officers investigated. They interviewed Thompson's crew, checked field notes, and tried to contact higher command. They confirmed the kill count and 0 American casualties. They could not prove that Thompson broke orders because the communication lines had failed. His unauthorized firing had become a case study in what one trained, observant, and brave soldier could accomplish. The paradox was clear. Obedience is valued in war, yet it sometimes limits action. Thompson followed his own logic and knowledge of enemy patterns, saving lives where waiting for orders could have caused disaster. He did not fire recklessly. Each shot had a purpose. Each sequence followed careful observation and calculations. He had not broken rules for pride or aggression. He had acted out of necessity. Even weeks later, when Thompson returned to training other gunners, he remained quiet. His method, targeting specific vehicles to create a chain reaction, was being studied at Fort Sill, Oklahoma. Soldiers learned that disabling convoys through sequence and understanding formations was often more effective than raw firepower. Thompson never sought glory. He returned home to Kansas after the war, married, and opened a small repair shop. His story remained largely unknown outside military circles. Yet the impact of his actions lasted. In the Ardennes, one gunner, working alone, had shown the power of observation, calculation, and courage. His actions proved that even in massive battles, strategy and precision could outweigh numbers. Thompson had rewritten the rules of engagement, not officially, but in the minds of soldiers who studied his approach. After the battle, the Germans were left in shock. Captured officers tried to explain what had happened. One lieutenant, face covered in ash, stammered, There were many guns. Maybe 6, maybe more." Another soldier swore he saw flashes from different angles. They imagined a full ambush, but in truth, it was just one tank, one gunner, and a few crew members. Fear made them see more than existed. American intelligence officers studied the engagement closely. They reviewed Thompson's sketches, notes, and firing sequence. Every detail confirmed the precision and planning behind the attack. 7 German vehicles destroyed, 4 more damaged, 0 American casualties. A single soldier had saved a vital road, protected the 101st Airborne, and disrupted a major enemy advance. The numbers were real, the results undeniable. Captain Langston met with Thompson after the report. He expected to reprimand him for disobedience. Instead, he saw something else. The logic in Thompson's notebook, the careful study of enemy formations, and the controlled chaos created by the sequence of shots. Langston told him, "We are studying this, but don't put it in official briefings yet. We will watch your work." Thompson nodded quietly. There were no medals, no fanfare, but his actions became a lesson for future soldiers. The army began using Thompson's approach as a training example. They called it asymmetrical engagement sequencing. The idea was simple: target key points in a column, create a choke point, and let the enemy's own formation work against them. No brute force was needed. His single engagement outside Noville became part of military manuals at Fort Sill and Fort Benning. Soldiers learned to disable enemy columns through careful observation and strategy, rather than sheer firepower. Even decades later, historians studied Thompson's actions. One military historian found the original report and tracked Thompson, now in his 80s, living quietly in Kansas with his wife and a cat named Murphy. Asked about that day, Thompson said, "I remember the trees. I remember how still it was before the first shot, like the world was holding its breath." He didn't speak of victory or glory. For him, it was always about precision and necessity. The paradox of Thompson's story remained. He followed his own rules, acted alone, and achieved results that an entire unit might have struggled to reach. War often rewards obedience, yet sometimes it rewards those who understand when it is necessary to step beyond orders. Thompson did not act out of defiance. He acted out of responsibility, calculation, and the need to protect his fellow soldiers. His story also shows how perception can differ from reality. The Germans believed they faced a full ambush. Soldiers and officers later told exaggerated stories of multiple tanks, batteries, or even airborne attacks. All of these stories were false, but fear and confusion created them. Thompson's careful and precise actions had created an illusion far greater than the reality. Finally, Thompson's life after the war was quiet and ordinary. He married, ran a repair shop, and taught his son geometry by marking angles in the dirt. He never called himself a hero. Yet through his actions, the army learned a new way to think about engagements. One soldier, armed with knowledge, courage, and patience, had changed how battles could be fought. The lesson was clear: strategy, observation, and precision can save lives and win battles, even against larger forces. Years later, the story of Ray Thompson became part of military history. Though quietly, his single engagement in the Ardennes showed how one person could change the outcome of a battle. Soldiers studied his notes, diagrams, and firing sequence to learn the idea of targeting key points to create controlled collapse in enemy formations. One gunner had shown that brains and observation could sometimes be more powerful than brute force. The impact of Thompson's actions spread beyond the forest road. Military doctrine changed. In training schools at Fort Sill and Fort Benning, new tank destroyer crews learned how to disable enemy armored columns by sequence and precision. They called it asymmetrical engagement sequencing. Thompson's ideas were studied for decades, applied to hypothetical scenarios in Europe, and used to prepare American soldiers for future conflicts during the Cold War. One Kansas farm boy had influenced the strategy of a whole army. Thompson himself never sought recognition. He returned home to Kansas, married Helen, and ran a repair shop near Dodge City. He fixed tractors, built grain silos, and taught his son math in the simplest way, marking angles in the dirt. He never spoke of heroism. He never asked for medals. To him, the day in the Ardennes was about calculation and duty, and yet others remembered. Soldiers passed down the story. Historians studied his field report. His quiet courage became a lesson in how careful observation and courage can make the impossible happen. The paradox of Thompson's story was clear. Obeying rules is essential in war, but knowing when to act without them can save lives. Thompson did not break the law. He stepped past it, just enough to do what was necessary. One soldier, with patience, calculation, and skill, had outsmarted a disciplined German column. 7 vehicles destroyed, 4 disabled, 0 Americans lost, and a vital road kept open. That was the real victory. On a larger scale, this single event reflected the balance between freedom and discipline, chaos and order, courage and caution. The Germans left the Ardennes believing in a ghost battery, terrified of forces that didn't exist. The Americans gained a lesson in the power of one decision, one gunner, one firing pattern, and an entire column was stopped. It reminded future soldiers that war is not just about numbers, it is about understanding, timing, and the human mind. In the end, Thompson's legacy was not medals or fame, it was knowledge, strategy, and example. The army learned that precision could triumph over size, patience over panic, and calculation over impulse. He showed that bravery is not always loud. Sometimes it whispers, sometimes it calculates, and sometimes it pulls the trigger at the right moment. They had come to Ardennes as soldiers, faced the cold, fear, and enemy discipline, and one man's quiet action left a lasting mark. The lesson: courage can be methodical, power can be subtle, and sometimes the greatest weapon is a mind that sees the battlefield like a chessboard. In the end, America's greatest weapon was not its tanks, not its artillery, not its numbers, but its people. Observant, brave, and willing to act. Ray Thompson saved a road, a column, and many lives, proving that in war, a single decision can change history. Ray Thompson's story reminds us that history is shaped by choices, not just orders. One gunner, acting with intelligence and courage, saved lives and taught armies new ways to fight. Obedience is vital, yet wisdom and action sometimes outweigh rules. War is chaos, but careful thought, courage and observation can turn the tide. In Thompson's case, precision saved a column, a division, and showed the power of one.